Father, let's be honest. Your time for making big decisions is over. You're only here because this is your house, not because you're the head of the family. That role is mine now. The words, spoken by my only son, Ricardo, sliced through the quiet clinking of silverware in my grand dining room, hanging in the air with the weight of a death sentence. They were not delivered in a fit of rage, but with a calculated coldness that was far more chilling. Across the polished mahogany table, his wife Sonia watched me with a glint of triumphant expectation in her eyes. In that moment, I wasn't a father being addressed by his child. I was an obstacle being informed of its obsolescence. The carefully prepared Thursday dinner, a tradition I had upheld for years, had just become the stage for the final act of their betrayal. Before I continue with the story of how that single sentence set in motion a plan they never saw coming, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Now you must understand that Ricardo's statement was not a surprise to me. It was merely a confirmation, the final piece of evidence in a case I had been silently building for over a year. It was the signal, the green light I needed to proceed, to protect my life's work, not from strangers, but from the very people who should have been its staunchest guardians. My name is Armando, and at 72 years old, I am a retired civil engineer. I spent 45 years of my life designing and overseeing the construction of bridges and buildings, structures meant to stand the test of time. My late wife, Elena, always said I built our life with the same meticulous precision. After she passed, I poured that same energy into managing the small but solid portfolio of properties we had acquired through decades of diligent work and frugal living. I'm a man who believes in blueprints, in solid foundations, and in understanding the structural integrity of things, including the character of the people around me. My calm demeanor is often mistaken for fragility, an error in judgment I have learned to use to my advantage. The Thursday night dinners started as my attempt to keep the family fabric from unraveling after Elena was gone. I wanted to preserve a sense of normalcy, a connection for my son, Ricardo, and his wife, Sonia. In the beginning, they were warm gatherings filled with shared memories and genuine conversation. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the atmosphere began to change. The warmth cooled into a forced cordiality. The conversations became superficial, and the air grew thick with unspoken intentions. My home, once a sanctuary of family love, now felt like a gilded cage where I was the main exhibit, observed and evaluated weekly by my own flesh and blood. I am an engineer. I'm trained to notice details, to see the stress fractures before they become catastrophic failures. I saw them in the way Sonia's eyes would scan the paintings on the wall, her gaze lingering a little too long, not with appreciation, but with an unnerving sense of appraisal. I saw it in the way Ricardo would deftly steer any conversation about my friends or hobbies towards my health, his questions about my memory or my physical strength thinly veiled attempts to gauge my decline. They stopped seeing a father and began seeing a collection of assets with a rapidly approaching expiration date. They were no longer my family. They were vultures, patiently circling, waiting for the feast to begin. Ricardo, my son, now 42, has always been the great disappointment of my life, a project I could never quite complete successfully. He was blessed with intelligence, but cursed with a profound laziness and an unshakable sense of entitlement. His life has been a string of failed business ventures, each one launched with my financial backing, and each one collapsing under the weight of his incompetence and aversion to hard work. To shield him from the consequences of his own failures, I gave him and Sonia one of my finest properties to live in, rent-free, and provided a generous monthly allowance that funded a lifestyle of leisure they had done nothing to earn. My hope was that this security would inspire him to build something of his own. Instead, it only deepened his parasitic nature. If Ricardo was the vessel of greed, Sonia was its navigator. At 40, she possessed an ambition and a ruthlessness that my son lacked. She was the one who sharpened his resentment, who fueled his sense of being wronged, and who articulated the strategy for what they saw as their rightful inheritance. I had overheard their hushed conversations when they thought I was napping, her voice a venomous whisper in his ear, coaching him, pushing him to be more aggressive, to challenge my authority. She portrayed my careful financial planning as the ramblings of a senile old man, and my continued existence as a stubborn refusal to step aside and let them live the life they felt they deserved. She was the true architect of my son's monstrous transformation. That fateful Thursday, the tension was more palpable than ever. The aroma of the roast beef, a recipe Eleanor had taught me, filled the room, a ghostly reminder of happier times. I watched them across the table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the chandelier. They were performing their roles in this weekly charade, making meaningless small talk about the weather and local politics, but their eyes gave them away. They exchanged fleeting, complicit glances, tiny sparks of impatience that revealed their true purpose. They were here to monitor their investment, to check on the stubborn old man who was taking far too long to fade away, holding the keys to their future in his aging hands. It was then that I decided to spring the trap. I needed one final, unambiguous display of their intentions, a piece of evidence so clear it could never be denied or excused. Taking a slow sip of water, I looked at them and spoke in a casual, thoughtful tone. "I've been thinking," I began, "I might sell the apartment on Elm Street. I've always wanted to take a long trip through Europe, see the world while I still can. The funds from the sale would make it more than comfortable." I watched their faces carefully, knowing the words would act as a lit match tossed into a room full of gasoline. The effect was instantaneous and exactly as I had predicted. Sonia was the first to react, her mask of civility cracking under the strain. Her fork clattered loudly onto her plate, the sound echoing in the silent room. She quickly composed herself, her face a carefully constructed tableau of loving concern. "Oh, Armando," she said, her voice dripping with counterfeit sweetness, "is that really a good idea? Traveling so far at your age? It could be very strenuous. We just worry about your health, that's all." Her words were a lie, and we both knew it. Her concern wasn't for my health. It was for the potential liquidation of a prime asset, a piece of her future inheritance being selfishly spent on an old man's whims. Ricardo, however, had no patience for such theatrics. His face, which had been a mask of bored indifference, contorted into a scowl of pure, unfiltered rage. He slammed his hand lightly on the table, not enough to make a scene, but enough to convey his deep-seated irritation. "Worry? Sonia, for God's sake, let's stop this pathetic act," he spat, his gaze fixed on her. Then he turned his cold, hard eyes on me, the pretense of the dutiful son finally dissolving like sugar in water. The years of resentment, of feeling overshadowed and entitled, all boiled to the surface, and the polite facade was stripped away to reveal the predator lurking beneath. And that is when he delivered his proclamation, the words I had been waiting for him to say. "Father, let's be honest. Your time for making big decisions is over. You're only here because this is your house, not because you're the head of the family. That role is mine now." The silence that followed was absolute. He leaned back in his chair, a smug look of finality on his face, as if he had just checkmated a king. He believed he had finally asserted his dominance over a weak, fading old man. But he was wrong. Those words were not an end. They were the beginning. They were the key that unlocked the door to a plan I had meticulously crafted, a strategy designed not for revenge, but for justice. The battle had just been declared, and I was ready. As Ricardo's cruel words settled in the space between us, a profound and chilling calm washed over me. The part of me that was a grieving father, the part that had hoped for some spark of decency in my son, died in that moment. It was replaced by the engineer, the strategist, the man who had spent a lifetime analyzing problems and designing solutions. I felt no surge of anger, no sting of heartbreak. Instead, my mind became a blueprint of action. The situation was no longer a messy family dispute. It was a structural failure that required immediate and decisive intervention. I looked at my son and daughter-in-law, their faces smug with perceived victory, and I knew my response would not be emotional. It would be methodical, precise, and absolute. Feigning a weariness I did not feel, I slowly placed my napkin on the table beside my plate. "I'm feeling a bit tired," I announced, my voice steady. "I think I'll turn in for the night. Please, help yourselves to dessert. Just lock the door on your way out." I rose from my chair, not waiting for a response, and walked out of the dining room, feeling their triumphant eyes on my back. They mistook my quiet withdrawal for surrender, for the defeated retreat of a broken old man. They couldn't have been more wrong. I wasn't retreating. I was moving my command center to a more strategic position, readying myself for the maneuver that would redefine our entire relationship. In the solitude of my study, I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat in my leather armchair, the same one where I had read stories to Ricardo as a boy, and I allowed the cold logic to take complete control. My objective was not vengeance. Vengeance is a messy, emotional act driven by passion. What I planned was a course correction. I would not destroy my son, but I would dismantle the corrupt and entitled world he and his wife had built for themselves. I would force them to confront the consequences of their actions, not out of malice, but out of a final, desperate act of fatherly duty. They needed to learn the value of work, respect, and self-sufficiency, a lesson my generosity had tragically prevented them from ever learning. This plan had not been conceived in that moment of confrontation. Its foundations had been laid more than a year prior. It began with a seemingly innocent question from Sonia during one of our Sunday lunches. "Armando, have you thought about granting Ricardo power of attorney? It would make things so much easier if, anything were to happen." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp and focused. That single comment was the first tremor, the first warning of an impending earthquake. The very next day, I scheduled a consultation with Dr. Valladares, a name I had come across in a financial journal, described as the foremost legal mind in São Paulo for asset protection and estate planning. Our first meeting was one of professional synergy. Dr. Valladares was a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his 50s, with a mind as analytical as my own. I laid out my concerns, not as a fearful old man, but as a CEO outlining a potential hostile takeover. I presented my financial portfolio and my observations of my son's and daughter-in-law's behavior. He listened intently, without a hint of pity, only a growing professional respect. "Mr. Armando," he said after I had finished, "most people come to me after the attack has already begun. You are here, building the fortress before the enemy has even appeared on the horizon. This we can work with." Over the next few months, Dr. Valladares and I worked meticulously, not just drafting a will, but re-engineering my entire financial existence. The masterstroke of our strategy was the creation of a holding company, a corporate entity into which I transferred ownership of all my properties and investments. This single act moved my wealth from the realm of personal inheritance to the domain of corporate law, a far more defensible and complex territory. The legal structure was brilliant in its simplicity and its impenetrability. It created a legal firewall between my assets and the greedy hands of my would-be heirs, a barrier they would be wholly unprepared to face. Within the articles of this new holding company, I was designated as the sole lifetime administrator, granting me absolute and irrevocable control over every decision, every transaction, every single cent. But the most crucial element, the legal cornerstone of my entire defense, was a bespoke clause Dr. Valladares drafted himself. He called it the indignity clause. It explicitly stated that any designated beneficiary who engaged in acts of coercion, elder abuse, or initiated legal proceedings to contest the administrator's authority or mental capacity would be immediately and permanently excluded from any and all inheritance. Their greed would be the very instrument of their own disinheritance. With the legal fortress in place, I moved on to the next phase, intelligence gathering. On the recommendation of Dr. Valadares' firm, I hired a discreet security company to install a state-of-the-art surveillance system in my home. Microscopic lenses were hidden inside smoke detectors in the living room and my office, and tiny audio recorders were placed in inconspicuous locations. Ricardo and Sonia always presumed I was a technological dinosaur, a man who struggled with a smartphone. This ageist assumption was a vulnerability I was all too happy to exploit. While they saw an old man fumbling with a tablet, I was actually monitoring high-definition video and audio feeds. Watching their conspiracy unfold in real time, the evidence I began to collect was astonishing and sickening. I catalogued everything in a locked digital folder, which I named the Ricardo Project. There were audio recordings of Sonia berating Ricardo for being too soft with me, urging him to up the pressure. I screen captured their failed attempts to log into my online banking portals. Their digital fingerprints, a clear record of their intent. I documented every lie, every instance of manipulation, every veiled threat. The folder grew week by week, becoming a comprehensive and damning indictment of their character. Meticulously organized and ready to be deployed at the opportune moment. Now, with the final confirmation from the dinner incident, my strategy shifted from passive observation to active engagement. I began to play the part they had cast for me, the confused, grieving father, deeply wounded by his son's words. When they called to apologize a few days later, their voices thick with fake remorse, I responded with sighs and broken sentences. I allowed them to believe they had broken my spirit, that their power play had succeeded. My apparent fragility was the perfect camouflage, lulling the predators into a false sense of security and encouraging them to become reckless. And reckless they became. Emboldened by my seeming collapse, their visits became more frequent and their actions more audacious. They would arrive unannounced, citing their worry for my well-being. Sonia would tidy up my office, her movements a little too thorough, her hands lingering on my desk drawers. Ricardo would speak to me in the slow, patronizing tone one uses for a child, constantly suggesting that I let him help with my finances, that the stress was becoming too much for me. They believed they were skillfully managing a senile old man towards the inevitable handover of his assets. In reality, they were performers on a stage, and I was the unseen director recording their every move. The surveillance system captured their escalating desperation in crystal-clear detail. On my tablet, I watched them let themselves into my home on a Tuesday afternoon, using the key I had given them for emergencies. They believed I was at my weekly chess club. I was, in fact, sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks away, watching the live feed. I saw them walk directly into my office, a place they now treated as their own. Sonia went straight for my filing cabinet, while Ricardo attempted to guess the password on my desktop computer. Their hushed whispers were perfectly captured by the audio recorder. "The will must be in here somewhere," Sonia muttered, her voice tight with frustration and greed. They found nothing of substance, of course. All critical documents had been moved to a secure vault at Dr. Valadares' office months ago. But their actions provided me with irrefutable proof of their intent. They were no longer just opportunistic children. They were actively engaged in a conspiracy to defraud me. They were trespassing, searching for private documents, and plotting to seize control of my estate. Each click of a drawer handle, each whispered curse of frustration, was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building around them. They were so blinded by their greed that they couldn't see they weren't robbing a house. They were walking deeper into a meticulously laid trap. Then came the discovery that solidified my resolve and erased any lingering trace of familial sentiment. One evening, as I reviewed the day's recordings, I witnessed them having a video conference in my living room. On their laptop screen was the face of a man I instantly disliked, with shifty eyes and a predatory smile. They addressed him as Dr. Moura, a name I later learned was associated with a lawyer known for his expertise in a particularly vile field, filing petitions for the legal interdiction of elderly parents. He was a bottom feeder, a legal jackal who profited from destroying families for a percentage of the estate. I listened, my blood turning to ice, as my son and daughter-in-law detailed their case against me to this vulture. They twisted my everyday moments of forgetfulness, misplacing my reading glasses, calling a neighbor by the wrong name, into a narrative of advanced, senile dementia. They spoke of my erratic behavior, citing my desire to travel as proof of my financial incompetence. Sonia laughed as she described how easy it would be to get my doctor to sign off on an evaluation, suggesting they could bribe him if necessary. They were plotting to have me legally declared a non-person, to strip me of my autonomy, my rights, my very identity, all for the sake of money. This was their greatest betrayal. It went far beyond mere greed or entitlement. This was a plan to erase me, to lock me away mentally and perhaps physically, while they plundered the fruits of my life's labor. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively trying to accelerate the process, to bury me while I was still breathing. Hearing them laugh with that despicable lawyer about my fading mind was the moment the engineer in me finalized the design. The structure of their lives, built on my generosity, was fundamentally unsound and needed to be demolished. The coming lesson would not be gentle. It would be a controlled demolition. My decision was no longer just about teaching them a lesson in respect. It was now about self-preservation and a more profound form of justice. My plan had to be flawless in its execution, leaving them no legal loopholes, no room to play the victim, no avenue of escape. The evidence I possessed was now overwhelming. The video of their consultation with Dr. Mura was the final, critical component. It was proof of a premeditated conspiracy, a legal and moral transgression of the highest order. They thought they were the hunters, closing in on their prey. They had no idea that the trap had already sprung. I spent the next week making the final preparations with Dr. Valladares. We organized the evidence into a devastating presentation. We reviewed the terms of the contract I would offer them, ensuring it was legally binding and utterly inescapable. My emotional state had transitioned into one of pure, dispassionate focus. The man they thought was losing his mind was, in fact, operating with more clarity than ever before. He was a general on the eve of a battle he knew he had already won, meticulously arranging his forces for a confrontation that would be not a slaughter, but a profound and permanent realignment of power. Their confidence had become their greatest liability. They called me daily, their voices syrupy with false concern, asking if I was feeling all right, if I needed anything. Each call was a fresh layer of hypocrisy that strengthened my resolve. They saw my quiet, monosyllabic responses as a sign of my continued decline, of my spirit finally breaking. They were preparing for their final push, the legal action that would grant them control. They were so focused on the prize that they never once stopped to look at the ground beneath their feet, to see that it was beginning to crumble. The final conversation I had with Dr. Valladares before setting the confrontation in motion was brief and direct. "Are you certain you wish to offer them a path forward, Armando?" he asked, his tone serious. "With this evidence, you could pursue criminal charges. You could ruin them completely." I considered his words for a moment. "Ruin is not the goal, Doctor," I replied firmly. "Restoration is. I'm not destroying my son. I'm forcing him to be born at the age of 42 into the real world. This is not an execution. It is a controlled demolition from which something new and, I hope, stronger can be built." And so the stage was set. I had the legal structure, the undeniable evidence, and the unwavering resolve. My grief for the son I had lost had been replaced by a duty to the man he could still, perhaps, become. The coming meeting in my office would not be a negotiation. It would be a sentencing. I would present them with the unvarnished truth of their own depravity, and then lay out the stark reality of their new lives. They had mistaken my patience for weakness and my silence for senility. They were about to learn, in the most painful way imaginable, that the old engineer still knew how to build an unbreakable structure. I looked at the calendar and chose the following Thursday for our family meeting. 1 week to the day from their declaration of war. It seemed fitting. The dining room had been their chosen battlefield where they believed they had won. My office, the heart of my life's work and planning, would be the site of their unconditional surrender. I sent them a simple text message. Ricardo and Sonia, I need to have a meeting with you both in my office next Thursday at 10 a.m. to discuss the future of the family assets. Please be prompt. The bait was laid. I knew with absolute certainty they would arrive giddy with anticipation, believing their moment had finally come. My actions were cold, yes, but they were born from a place of profound clarity. When a structure is compromised by rot, you do not simply patch the cracks. You must strip it down to the foundation and rebuild it with sound materials. Ricardo and Sonia were the rot in the house I had built. My generosity had been the moisture that allowed that rot to fester and spread. Now, the time had come to expose it to the harsh, dry air of reality. The turnaround was not just about turning the tables on them. It was about forcing them to build their own table, their own chairs, their own house for the very first time in their coddled lives. The following Thursday morning, at precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I watched on my security monitor as Ricardo and Sonia stood on my porch, their attire speaking volumes about their expectations. He was in a tailored blazer, she in an elegant dress, looking every bit the part of heirs, arriving to discuss the terms of their new dominion. They carried an air of triumphant finality, the confident posture of predators who believe their prey has finally succumbed. When my housekeeper led them into my office, their smiles were wide and ready, but they faltered the moment they saw the third man in the room. Dr. Valladares, seated in the chair opposite my desk, rose politely. His presence, an immediate and jarring anomaly in their carefully constructed narrative of victory. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The anticipated warmth of a family capitulation was replaced by the cold, sterile air of a legal proceeding. Ricardo's smile vanished, replaced by a confused frown. Sonia's eyes narrowed, darting from me to my lawyer, her mind racing to process this unexpected variable. They sat down cautiously in the chairs I indicated, their body language transforming from relaxed arrogance to tense apprehension. I remained silent, allowing the weight of the unspoken to press down on them. For the first time, a flicker of doubt, a shadow of fear crossed their faces. They were beginning to understand that this was not the meeting they had envisioned. I let the silence stretch for another full minute before I spoke, my voice calm and devoid of emotion. "Thank you for coming," I said, my gaze steady. "I have called this meeting to provide clarity on the future of this family and its assets. Before we discuss the future, however, we must first establish a clear understanding of the present." With a press of a button on my desk, a large television screen mounted on the wall behind me hummed to life. Their eyes, wide with a mixture of curiosity and dread, were drawn to the screen. The show was about to begin, and they were the unwilling stars. The first images that appeared were from the security camera in my office, time-stamped from the Tuesday afternoon they believed I was at my chess club. I watched their faces as they saw themselves on screen like ghosts caught in the act. The color drained from Sonia's cheeks as she watched her on-screen counterpart rummaging through my desk drawers. Ricardo's jaw went slack, his eyes fixed on the footage of himself trying and failing to guess my computer password. There was no sound, just the stark, undeniable video evidence of their transgression, playing out in front of them in crystal-clear high definition. Their shared look of horror was palpable. Next came the audio clips, layered over a black screen. Sonia's sharp, condescending voice coaching Ricardo on how to manipulate me. "You need to be firm, Ricardo. He's losing it. Treat him like a child." Then Ricardo's resentful muttering about how long I was taking to let go, each recorded whisper, each cruel phrase echoed in the dead silence of the office, stripping away their facade of loving concern, layer by painful layer. Sonia sank lower in her chair, unable to meet my gaze, while Ricardo stared at the floor, his face a mask of shame and disbelief. They were being confronted with the ugliest version of themselves, and there was nowhere to hide. The presentation culminated in the pièce de résistance, the video recording of their conference call with the disreputable Dr. Mora. I let the entire conversation play out, their casual discussion of having me declared mentally incompetent. Their laughter as they twisted my minor memory lapses into symptoms of senility, their plotting to bribe my doctor. The sound of their own gleeful voices conspiring to strip me of my identity filled the room, a grotesque soundtrack to their own downfall. I paused the video on a freeze frame of them both smiling at the lawyer, their faces alight with greed. Then I turned the screen off and faced them in the heavy, suffocating silence. It was then that Dr. Valladares spoke for the first time, his voice a calm, dispassionate instrument of law. "As you can see," he began, gesturing towards a stack of documents on my desk, "we have compiled a comprehensive dossier of your activities over the past 18 months. He proceeded to explain, in clear and simple terms, the legal reality of their situation. He detailed the formation of the holding company, explaining how my personal assets were now under corporate protection. He described my role as the sole, unchallengeable lifetime administrator, with absolute power over all assets and decisions. Their faces were blank slates of shock, struggling to process the information. Then Dr. Valladares delivered the killing blow. Most importantly," he continued, picking up a single sheet of paper, "I want to draw your attention to Article 7, Section B of the company's charter, the indignity clause." He read the clause aloud, the legal language cold and precise, explicitly stating that any beneficiary who attempts to coerce, defraud, or legally challenge the mental capacity of the administrator forfeits all present and future rights to any inheritance. Your actions, as documented on video and audio, represent a clear and egregious violation of this clause. Legally speaking, as of this moment, you are both completely and irrevocably disinherited. A strangled gasp escaped Sonia's lips. Ricardo looked as if he had been physically struck, his face pale and clammy. They were speechless, their minds reeling from the swift and total annihilation of the future they had believed was their birthright. Their world, which an hour ago had seemed so certain and close at hand, had been demolished in the span of 10 minutes. The fortune they had plotted to seize had vanished into thin air, protected by a legal fortress they never even knew existed. They were no longer heirs in waiting. They were simply two people sitting in a room, facing the architect of their ruin. It was at that moment that I finally spoke again, my voice cutting through their stunned silence. I slid a document across the desk towards them. "This is not, however, the end," I said. "It is a new beginning. This contract outlines the terms of your future." I watched them as they stared at the paper, too afraid to touch it. I then laid out the conditions one by one. First, they were to vacate the property they lived in within 30 days. Second, all financial support, including the generous monthly allowance, was terminated, effective immediately. Third, Ricardo was required to secure full-time, registered employment and provide me with quarterly proof of his continued work for a minimum of 5 years. The list of conditions continued, each one a systematic dismantling of their coddled existence. Fourth, they were required to attend mandatory family therapy with a psychologist of my choosing to address the profound moral and ethical failures that had led them to this point. I explained that this was not a punishment, but a restorative ultimatum. It was their one and only path forward. It was a chance not to regain my wealth, but to perhaps build a life of their own, based on principles they had long since abandoned: work, dignity, and self-respect. Their expressions had shifted from shock to a dawning, sickening comprehension of their new reality. As they stared at the contract in disbelief, Dr. Valadares added the final, chilling stipulation. "You should also understand the alternative," he said calmly. "Should you refuse these terms, or fail to comply with any single clause at any point, the complete dossier of evidence, including the video of your meeting with Dr. Mora, will be delivered to the public prosecutor's office. The potential charges are severe: conspiracy to commit fraud, coercion of a vulnerable adult, and emotional distress, among others. We are confident a conviction would be all but certain." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The choice is yours: a difficult path to rebuilding your lives, or public humiliation and potential incarceration." There was nothing left to say. The trap was not only sprung, but had proven to be inescapable. Ricardo, trembling slightly, picked up the pen and signed the document without even reading it. Sonia, after a long, soul-crushing moment, did the same, her signature a barely legible scrawl. They rose from their chairs like automatons, their arrogance completely extinguished, replaced by the hollowed-out look of the utterly defeated. They walked out of my office, not as the proud conquerors they had arrived as, but as two ghosts, stripped of their power, their status, and their future, leaving only the signed contract on my desk as evidence of their surrender. I can only imagine the car ride back to the house they would soon have to leave. The silence must have been deafening, thick with unspoken accusations and the bitter taste of failure. The united front they had presented for so long, their partnership forged in mutual greed, would have begun to crack under the immense pressure of their shared catastrophe. Every glance would have been filled with blame. Sonia would see Ricardo not as her partner, but as a weak, incompetent fool who had failed to secure their future. Ricardo would see Sonia as the venomous schemer whose ambition had pushed them over the edge into ruin. Ruin. Once home, the dam of their resentment would have burst. I can picture the ensuing argument, the raw, ugly recriminations hurled across the beautifully furnished living room that was no longer theirs. "This is your fault!" Sonia would have shrieked, her voice laced with fury. "You were too soft, too stupid. I told you we needed to be more aggressive." Ricardo, finally stripped of the bravado my money had always afforded him, would have lashed back, his words full of a lifetime of resentment. "My fault? You were the one pushing this. You and your disgusting greed. You were never happy with what we had." Their first instinct, once the initial shock wore off, would have been to seek help, to find an ally. Sonia would have been the first to pick up the phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she dialed her wealthy parents. She would have tried to spin a narrative of a cruel, senile father lashing out, but her story would have crumbled quickly. Unbeknownst to her, Dr. Valadares had already dispatched a concise, fact-based email to her father, a man I knew valued reputation above all else, outlining the situation and attaching a short, damning clip of the video evidence. The financial support she expected would be met with a cold wall of shame and rejection. Next, they would have turned to their friends, the glamorous social circle they had cultivated, funded entirely by my generosity. They would have discovered just how shallow those relationships truly were. The invitations to dinner parties and weekend getaways would evaporate overnight. The friends who had once admired their lifestyle and coveted their connections would now see them as toxic, a liability. Their social status, which Sonia prized more than anything, was not tied to their character but to their perceived wealth. With that wealth gone, they became social lepers, isolated and shunned by the very people they had worked so hard to impress. The isolation would become total. Family members I had discreetly informed would offer not sympathy but condemnation. Their world, once a comfortable bubble of privilege and leisure, had shrunk to the size of their own shared failure. There was no one to borrow money from, no one to offer them a place to stay, no one to listen to their self-pitying stories. They were utterly alone, trapped in a house of impending eviction with nothing but their mutual resentment for company. The very foundation of their life together. The pursuit of my money had been obliterated, and they were discovering that without it, there was nothing of substance holding them together. The loss of status would be a particularly sharp blade for Sonia. The designer clothes, the luxury car, the exclusive club memberships, all these symbols of success she had wielded like weapons were now meaningless. She would have to face the humiliation of her dramatic fall from grace, a public spectacle among her peers. Every whispered conversation, every averted gaze from a former friend at the grocery store would be a fresh stab of humiliation. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of sand, and now, as the tide of reality washed in, she was left with nothing but the wreckage. For Ricardo, the consequences would be more internal, a crushing blow to his fragile ego. For his entire life, he had defined himself in opposition to me, yet had been completely dependent on me. He saw my wealth as his birthright, a safety net that allowed him to fail without consequence. Now that net was gone. At 42 years old, he was facing the terrifying prospect of having to stand on his own 2 feet for the first time in his life. The world was no longer a playground funded by his father. It was a harsh, unforgiving place that demanded work and responsibility. 2 concepts entirely foreign to him. The rupture of their own bond would be the most profound consequence. Their marriage had been a business partnership disguised as a romance, with my inheritance as the shared corporate goal. With that goal eliminated, the partnership was rendered bankrupt. The shared dream that had united them had become a shared nightmare that was now tearing them apart. The blame and bitterness would fester, poisoning whatever affection might have once existed between them. They were not just facing the loss of a lifestyle, they were facing the total collapse of their relationship, a casualty of their own moral decay. In the end, they were left with only 2 certainties. They had lost everything, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The beautiful house became a prison, its luxurious furnishings mocking them with memories of a life they could no longer have. Every object was a testament to a generosity they had repaid with treachery. The 30-day eviction notice was not just a legal document. It was a countdown to a new, terrifying reality. They had awakened from their dream of effortless wealth to find themselves in a disaster of their own making. The consequences were not born of my cruelty, but were the natural Newtonian reaction to their actions. For every deceitful act, there was now a corresponding price to be paid. For every moment of disrespect, there was a consequence of humiliation. I had not sought to punish them in a fit of rage. I had simply removed the elaborate scaffolding of my support and forced them to see if their own structure, the one they had built together, could bear its own weight. It could not. It was collapsing around them, and the dust was just beginning to settle. The process was devastatingly effective. Their world did not crumble slowly. It was demolished in a single controlled explosion. The shockwave of that Thursday meeting radiated outwards, severing their social ties, bankrupting their relationship, and erasing their unearned status. They were left adrift, stripped of everything they had valued, forced to confront the barrenness of their own characters. The first phase of my plan was complete. The demolition was a success. Now the far more uncertain and painful process of reconstruction would have to begin. The first consequence of their signed surrender was the eviction. I watched from my security cameras as the moving truck arrived at the house I had gifted them years ago. It wasn't a large truck. They soon discovered that the vast majority of the luxurious furniture and art belonged to the holding company, not to them. They were permitted to take only their personal effects, a shockingly small pile of clothes, books, and trinkets. They moved into a small, 2-bedroom rented apartment in Moca, a modest, working-class neighborhood in São Paulo, a world away from the opulent district they had once called home. The contrast was a brutal and immediate lesson in their new reality. From the reports I received and the little I could glean from a distance, their first few months were a portrait of despair. The spacious, sunlit rooms of their former home were replaced by cramped quarters that smelled of old paint and damp. Sonia, who had never worried about money in her life, was now confronted with the harsh arithmetic of a limited budget. Ricardo was forced to sell their high-end German sedan for a fraction of its value just to cover the security deposit and first month's rent on their new, humble abode. The shock of their fall was not a gentle slope, but a violent, terrifying plummet to the very bottom. For Ricardo, hitting rock bottom meant confronting the necessity of work for the first time in his 42 years. His resume was a barren landscape of failed, father-funded ventures. No respectable company would hire him for a management position. After weeks of humiliating rejections, he was forced to take a job as a stock supervisor in a large supermarket warehouse, a physically demanding position that required him to be on his feet for 10 hours a day. The man who had once dreamed of running my empire was now lifting heavy boxes and taking orders from a manager half his age, all for a salary that was less than his former weekly allowance. Sonia's fall was no less jarring. Her days, once a carefully curated schedule of Pilates classes, lunches with friends and shopping sprees, were now an endless cycle of chores and anxiety. She learned to navigate the crowded public bus system, to comparison shop for the cheapest groceries, to mend clothes instead of discarding them. The designer handbags and shoes were sold off one by one to pay for utility bills and unexpected expenses. Her glamorous friends had, as I predicted, vanished completely, leaving her utterly isolated in a world she had never been prepared to inhabit. The silence in her small apartment was a constant, deafening reminder of everything she had lost. A crucial component of their forced redemption was the mandatory therapy. As per our agreement, I received brief, confidential progress reports from their psychologist, Dr. Almeida. The initial reports were grim. The first few sessions were, as she described them, a torrent of blame, self-pity, and vitriol directed at me. They saw themselves as the victims of a cruel, vindictive old man. Ricardo raged about the injustice of his situation, while Sonia wept for her lost status. They were a united front in their sense of victimhood, unable and unwilling to look at the true cause of their predicament, their own reflection in the mirror. Dr. Almeida, however, was a skilled and patient professional. She slowly and methodically began to dismantle their fortress of entitlement. She challenged their narratives, forcing them to confront the evidence of their own actions, which I had authorized her to review. "Your father did not do this to you," she would repeat, according to her notes. "He simply stopped doing things for you. There is a fundamental difference." This simple reframing of their situation was the first chisel strike against the hard marble of their arrogance, beginning a long and painful process of reshaping their entire worldview. Months bled into a year. The acute shock of their new life slowly subsided into a grueling routine. The physical exhaustion from Ricardo's job and the mental exhaustion from Sonia's constant financial worries left little energy for their bitter arguments. A grim, unspoken acceptance began to settle over them. They were no longer fighting against their reality. They were simply trying to survive it. In this shared struggle, an unexpected seed of a new kind of partnership was planted. When Ricardo would come home, his feet swollen and his back aching, Sonia would have a simple, hot meal waiting. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a flicker of mutual support, born from shared hardship. I learned from one of Dr. Almeida's reports that Ricardo's moment of clarity, his true psychological turning point, came almost a year into his new life. He had just received his paycheck, a small, tangible representation of 200 hours of grueling physical labor. As he stood at the bus stop, he stared at the amount on the check and realized it was less than what he and Sonia used to spend on a single impromptu dinner at a fancy restaurant. For the first time, he grasped the true value of money, not as an abstract inheritance, but as a direct result of time, sweat, and effort. It was a humbling, crushing, and ultimately transformative realization. In that moment on the bus stop, His lifelong resentment towards me finally began to dissolve, replaced by a nascent unfamiliar feeling, respect. He understood, in a way he never could have before, the sheer scale of the effort it must have taken for me to build the life he had so casually tried to steal. He saw my wealth not as a treasure chest he was entitled to, but as a mountain I had spent a lifetime climbing. And he, for the first time, felt a profound shame for having tried to simply fly to the summit on wings of greed, without ever taking a single step on his own. Sonia's epiphany was quieter, but no less profound. It occurred during one of her sessions with Dr. Almeida. The therapist asked her a simple question. If you could have your old life back tomorrow, what specific thing do you miss the most? Sonia began to list the material possessions, the house, the car, the trips, the clothes. But as she spoke the words aloud, she heard their hollowness. She realized she couldn't name a single friend she truly missed, a single activity that had given her genuine fulfillment. Her entire identity had been a carefully constructed illusion, built on a foundation of my money. She broke down in that session, finally mourning not the loss of her things, but the loss of her own soul. She recognized that my actions, as brutal as they had felt, had inadvertently saved her from a life of utter emptiness. She had been a ghost, haunting a beautiful house, and I had forced her into the uncomfortable, painful, but very real world of the living. She confessed to Dr. Almeida that for the first time she felt a strange sense of gratitude, not for what I had given her, but for what I had taken away. It was the removal of the gilded cage that finally gave her the chance to learn how to fly, however clumsily. This newfound clarity began to manifest in real, tangible changes. Ricardo, no longer viewing his job as a punishment, started to take a quiet pride in his work. He was reliable, punctual, and hardworking. His supervisor noticed. Within 18 months, he was promoted from a simple stocker to a warehouse shift manager, a position that came with a modest raise and, more importantly, a significant boost to his shattered self-esteem. He was no longer just his father's failed son. He was Ricardo, a man who earned his own living and provided for his family. Sonia, too, found a new sense of purpose. Tapping into a forgotten talent for baking, she started selling cakes and pastries to her neighbors. It began as a way to make a few extra reais, but it quickly grew into a small, thriving home business. She discovered a satisfaction in creating something with her own hands and earning her own money that no shopping spree had ever provided. She was no longer just a consumer. She was a producer, a creator. Her small kitchen, once a symbol of her reduced circumstances, became her new headquarters, a place of pride and productivity. Their relationship began a slow process of healing. The arguments, fueled by blame and resentment, were replaced by practical discussions about bills, schedules, and Sonia's growing list of orders. They were a team not in a conspiracy of greed, but in a partnership of survival. They learned to rely on each other, to appreciate the small victories, a paid bill, a positive customer review, a less tiring shift for Ricardo. The extravagant romance of their past was gone, but in its place, something more authentic and resilient began to grow, nurtured by the harsh soil of their new reality. They did not seek to recover their old life. Their motivations had fundamentally shifted. Their goal was no longer the acquisition of unearned wealth, but the construction of a stable, dignified existence. They found a new form of happiness, not in luxury, but in solvency. The joy of being able to pay their rent on time, of having enough food in the refrigerator, of knowing they had earned their place in the world, was a feeling more profound than any they had ever known. They were no longer parasites. They were survivors, slowly but surely building something of their own. I observed all of this from a distance, through the therapist's reports and my own discreet inquiries. I did not intervene. This was their journey to make, their mountain to climb. My role had been to force them to the trailhead and remove all other options. The redemption they were experiencing was not a gift from me. It was something they were earning for themselves, day by exhausting, humbling day. The process was slow, and I knew it was far from complete, but for the first time in many years, I felt a flicker of hope for my son and his wife. The bottom they had hit was not just a financial one. It was a moral and spiritual abyss. They were forced to confront the ugliest parts of themselves because there was nothing left to distract them. The hardship stripped them of their arrogance, their entitlement, and their illusions. It was a baptism by fire, burning away the dross and revealing, to my surprise and theirs, that there was something of value underneath it all. They were learning, in the most difficult way imaginable, the true meaning of wealth, and it had nothing to do with the numbers in a bank account. Their transformation was not a miracle. It was the logical outcome of imposed consequences. By removing the safety net, I had forced them to learn how to walk on the tightrope of life. They stumbled, they nearly fell, but they were learning to balance. They were discovering a strength and resilience they never knew they possessed because they had never been required to use it. The emptiness of their former lives was being filled not with possessions, but with purpose. A purpose forged in the crucible of their own hard-earned redemption. The reports from Dr. Almeida became more positive. She spoke of genuine remorse, of accountability, of a couple that was finally learning to communicate honestly. Sonia had expressed a desire to one day apologize to me, not to ask for anything, but simply to acknowledge the harm she had done. Ricardo had spoken of the shame he felt, but also of a newfound determination to become a man I could, if not be proud of, at least respect. These were developments I had scarcely dared to hope for. The wealth they had so desperately craved was, in a profound irony, the very thing that had kept them impoverished in character. By losing it all, they were given the chance to become truly rich for the first time in their lives. Their new apartment, though small and sparsely furnished, was more of a home than their previous mansion had ever been, because it was a home they were building together. With their own hands and their own sweat, it was a foundation, solid and real, upon which a new life could be constructed. This was the slow, painful, and deeply necessary process of their redemption. It was not about me forgiving them. It was about them becoming people who no longer needed my forgiveness to feel whole. They were learning that dignity is not something that can be inherited or bought. It must be earned. And in the humble setting of their new life, amidst the exhaustion and the struggle, they were finally beginning to earn it. The consequences had been severe, but the growth was proving to be genuine. 5 years have passed since that final, definitive meeting in my office. The silence that followed their departure that day was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for them, but for me as well. Shortly after they vacated their former home, I sold the large family house, with its echoing rooms and ghost-filled memories. I moved into a modern, luxurious apartment overlooking Ibirapuera Park, a place of light, efficiency, and security. And true to my word, I finally took that long trip through Europe. I walked the ancient streets of Rome, stood before the masterpieces in the Louvre, and watched the sunset over the Aegean Sea. I felt a lightness I hadn't realized I was missing. The freedom of a man who had finally settled his most difficult account. From the quiet distance I maintain, I have observed the trajectory of their new lives. Ricardo is now 47. He remains the shift manager at the same supermarket warehouse. The work has etched new lines onto his face and stripped away the soft paunch of his former life. He is thinner, weathered by fatigue, but his posture is straight and his eyes hold a steady, quiet dignity that was never there before. I am told he is respected by his team, known as a fair and hard-working boss. He's no longer the entitled boy who lived in my shadow, but a man who has been shaped and defined by the simple, unyielding rhythm of honest labor. Sonia, too, has been profoundly transformed. Her small home-baking business, born from desperation, has flourished through her sheer tenacity. It is not a grand enterprise, but it is a successful and respected local brand. It generates enough income that when combined with Ricardo's salary, they live a comfortable, middle-class life. They have moved from the cramped apartment in Muka to a slightly larger rented house in a decent neighborhood. Their relationship, once a toxic alliance of greed, has been reforged in the fires of adversity into a genuine partnership built on mutual support and a shared history of survival. They are a team in the truest sense of the word. Our contact is minimal, formal, and dictated by the terms of the original contract. Once a year, we have a brief meeting in Dr. Valadares' office, where Ricardo presents his proof of continued employment. These encounters are polite, almost sterile. There are no warm embraces, no easy reminiscing about the past. The chasm created by their betrayal is too wide to ever be fully bridged. The scar on our family remains, a permanent reminder of the wound beneath. What exists between us now is not the effortless love of a father and son, but a fragile, odd-won respect between two men who now understand each other perfectly. During our most recent meeting, after the formalities were concluded, Ricardo paused at the door. He turned to face me, his expression serious and unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might try to revisit the past, to ask for forgiveness or a change in terms. Instead, he said something that brought a quiet, unexpected closure to our long and painful saga. "Thank you, Father," he said, his voice low but clear. "Not for what you gave me, but for what you took away. Thank you for the lesson you were strong enough to teach me." It was not an apology, but an acknowledgement, a statement of profound and humbling clarity. I simply nodded, unable to speak for a moment. In his words, I heard no lingering bitterness, only the quiet wisdom of a man who had been forced to walk through fire and had emerged on the other side, cleansed and whole. In that moment, I felt no sense of victory or triumph, only a deep, abiding peace. My decision 5 years ago, which had felt so cold and severe, had been validated. I had not destroyed my son. I had saved him from himself. The justice I had implemented was not about winning a battle, but about restoring a moral equilibrium that allowed him, finally, to grow. This journey has taught me a great deal about the true nature of justice. I now understand that real justice is not the hot, impulsive fire of vengeance that seeks to burn everything to the ground. It is something colder, more deliberate, and ultimately more constructive. It is the precise, calculated application of consequences, a force designed not to annihilate, but to correct. My actions were not an attack on my son, but a radical, last-ditch effort to educate him in the fundamental principles of character and responsibility that he had never been forced to learn. It has also redefined my understanding of what it means to leave a legacy. For years, I believed my legacy was the portfolio of properties I had built, the tangible wealth I would pass down. I was wrong. A legacy is not what you leave for people, it's what you leave in them. My true legacy was not the inheritance I could have given Ricardo, but the character I was forced to help him build. By taking away his unearned fortune, I gave him the far greater gift of self-worth, a treasure he had to forge for himself, and which, therefore, could never be taken from him. The moral of this story is not a simple one. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest act of love is not to give, but to withhold. True strength is not demonstrated by endlessly propping someone up, but by having the courage to let them fall, trusting that they have the capacity to learn how to stand on their own. My son and his wife did not find redemption because I forgave them. They found it because they were forced into a situation where they had to earn their own, a far more valuable and lasting salvation. Theirs is a quiet life now, but it is their own. They continue to work, to save, and to build something modest but meaningful together. There is no grand reconciliation for us, no return to an idyllic past that perhaps never truly existed. There is only a quiet respect, a shared understanding across a necessary distance. The broken bond between a father and son was the price that had to be paid for that son to finally become a man. It's a bittersweet resolution, but it is one rooted in truth and dignity. My life is also quiet, but it is filled with peace. I travel, I read, I enjoy the fruits of my labor, knowing that I have done right by my past and my future. The value of a person, I have learned, is not measured by their status or their possessions, but by their resilience, their capacity for growth, and the integrity with which they face the consequences of their choices. This is the ultimate lesson, the foundation upon which any life of meaning must be built. If you enjoyed this story, please support us with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. To listen to the next story, click on the box that appears on your screen. Thank you for being with us.